Just trying to make sure I've got everything that I need. I think we're good. Okay, so yesterday we left off talking about the Gospels, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. We're sort of paying attention. Okay, so sweet. We are in this space where we're going to talk through what's going on with the Gospels. We said there are 4 Gospels. 3 of them we call the Synoptic Gospels, and one of them we call, well, the Gospel of John. Okay? Not to minimize it. The Gospel of John is sort of my thing. But just to say that's kind of how we break these things down. All right? So, first things first. Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic as a piece of vocabulary. This is important because we need to be clear on the vocabulary. Synoptic is a word that means seeing through the same eye. Okay? Seeing through the same eye. All right? So then the perspective and the storytelling and the accounts, perhaps, are going to be really similar in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Good? And then John is going to be really different. Right? So here's what I want you to do. We'll use Google and see how it goes. Go to Google, and I want you to search this phrase. You to search for the synoptic problem. Okay. Quick search, synoptic problem. Then we're going to talk through what you find there, and that's the subject for today. Okay? Are we okay?
Yes. I'm tired.
Okay. No. All right. What is the synoptic problem?
It's the question of a relationship of the 3 Gospels.
Okay. Parnell, what are you going to say?
That question a little more.
Nice and clear and loud.
The question as to the sources upon which each synoptic gospel and when it was written.
Okay. How did the synoptic gospels get their information such that they are related the way that they are? Yeah? Is that making sense? Okay. The question of sources due to similarities among the synoptics. Right? You with me so far? Okay. I'm going to give you some percentages so you can understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the similarities. Okay? And then we're going to look at some passages together today to highlight what we're talking about. Are you still with me? Okay. So, Of. So here's how it works. We're just going to take Matthew's gospel first. Matthew's gospel has 20% of what's in Matthew's gospel is unique to Matthew. It is only in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay? 20% of Matthew's gospel is only in the Gospel of Matthew. %10 is shared between Matthew and Mark. Okay? Good there? %25 is what gets called double tradition material, and it's shared between Matthew and Luke. I'm going to explain. Still with me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So then that leaves 45% of the gospel is what we call triple tradition. It's in all three synoptics. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Still with me? Okay. I'm going to pick on Ms. Kennedy.
Oh.
You submit to me a paper. It's a substantial piece of work. And you have 10% in common with somebody else. Is that going to be a problem? Like Turnitin.com similarity report.
Oh, it's 10%.
10%? I'm probably going to take a look at it. Right? Make sure that 10% is in quotations. Right? You submit a paper that's got 45% in common with two other pieces of work. What are the chances you and I are going to have a little chat? That's pretty high, isn't it? Like that's like, well, academic integrity kind of high. This is what we're talking about. If you turn something in today and it only has 20% of what's in that work that is unique to you, I got some questions. This is the similarity stuff we're talking about with the synoptics. That means 80% of what's in Matthew's gospel is also in another gospel. And we're not talking about like, oh yeah, they both told the same story about the blind guy. No. We're talking about like word for word similarities. Matthew picked these words, and these words are also in Luke and Mark. We're at 80%. That's just Matthew. Let's take a look at Luke. Luke %35 of the Gospel of Luke is unique to Luke. %1 is unique or is shared between Mark and Luke. That's a better number. Right? Okay. 1%. Mark and Luke, 1%. %23 is double tradition. Matthew and Luke share it in common. Which leaves 41% triple tradition shared among all three synoptics. So 65% of Luke's gospel is shared word for word in other places. That number, for our liking, is still too high, right? Yeah? Okay. Let's do Mark. Mark's gospel contains 3% as unique material to Mark only. 3% unique to Mark. That means 97% of Mark's gospel is going to show up in Matthew, Luke, or both. It's a lot. %18 of Mark's gospel is in Matthew and Mark. %3 is Mark and Luke. Which means %76 of Mark's gospel is triple tradition material. It's in all three synoptics. Okay, why do we call it double tradition if it's just Matthew and Luke? Because Mark overwhelmingly shares with the others. So when it's shared between Matthew and Luke, but not with Mark, we designate it specifically. Is that making sense? Okay. Is there a problem with this? Or does it just raise some curiosities? Go ahead.
I think it almost, like, I mean, we're saying that it's a problem, but I don't know if it's necessarily a problem because I think that they're all, like, confirming that the other one is true.
That's one way to look at it. Yeah, absolutely. Right? Which is why I said it's a question of sources and not, we're picking on discrepancies. Are you with me so far? It may not be a problem as such, as much as it's that's interesting. And how did that happen? Right? If you're just looking at the percentages, and we're trying to figure out source material and where people got what information, if you just look at the percentages, who do you think may have written their gospel first? And then other people may have come along and used it. I hear Luke. Explain why. Because he's the most unique. So people came along and sort of left bits out. Luke's also the longest. So let's do it this way. If I added this, Mark's the shortest, Luke's the longest, and Matthew's the middle, does that change who writes first in your understanding? It does. Okay, who do you think wrote first? Luke right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so people came along and took Luke's stuff and left bits out. Okay.
Yeah.
Hang on.
50% unique, like, I feel like people were just taking it all up and then we added some other.
Okay. So there's two ways to go about this, right? Typically, if you just look at the numbers and the statistics, you go one of two ways. It's the longest, and then people left stuff out when they made use of it. Or you go with the shortest, and people just added to it what they felt like needed to be added. Does that make sense? What does that do then? That makes Mark a source for Matthew and for Luke. So it means this. Mark wrote his gospel. Matthew and Luke came along later, took what already existed in Mark, and just added material they felt like needed to be added for importance. That's one option in explaining how this stuff relates. The other option is Luke wrote it, and when people used it, they left stuff out. Right? I think it's easier to explain adding than it is to explain leaving stuff out, especially when we consider that some of this in Luke includes parables like the lost sheep and the prodigal son and the good Samaritan. Why would anybody reading Luke's gospel and using it as a framework for their own leave that stuff out? Those are important. There's a whole series of hospitals around the globe called Good Samaritan, based on the parable. Like, why would anybody else using Luke's gospel as a template leave this stuff out? So,
Excuse me, can I talk to Alicia real quick? Just real
Yeah.
1 second. It's pretty important, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
it's okay. You guys with me on this? We're not saying there's a problem. We're saying, how did they get the similarities they have? Are you with me? The vast majority of scholars say Mark writes first. Because so much of Mark, 97% of Mark, 97% of Mark shows up somewhere else. Right? So the idea is, Mark writes it first, and Matthew and Luke just use what Mark's put down, and they add material they think is important. Go ahead.
How do we know that they were inspired by Mark and not inspired by God in the same way?
Valid question. How do we know they're stealing from Mark, so to speak, and not just inspired by the Spirit? It's a valid challenge to practical explanations. We don't necessarily. Right? How do we know they had Mark's document? We don't. Yeah? Documents, we've already said documents are hard to come by in the first century world, right? Well, if documents are hard to produce and they're hard to copy and they're hard to come by, then chances of having documents might be slim. So Matthew and Luke may not have Mark's gospel. So what else might they have? We don't know. Are you tracking with me on this? Okay. What we're trying to do and what we're trying to understand, okay? What we're trying to do and understand is explain as best as we can in our understandings how we landed 3 gospels that are word for word the same, but have little nuances to them in the same storyline. So we're going to look at some stories in a minute where you're going along and everything matches up between the 3 gospels, and all of a sudden there's a detail added. Or it looks added in a gospel because it's not in the other ones. Or there's something missing, like words from Jesus or something.
What if, because you said that they were really hard to come by, right?
Sure.
But what if, since they're so hard to come by, those are the only guys that came by them?
It's a valid challenge, and it's viable. The problem is we don't know. That's exactly the point. We don't know. We can't put it together.
So what do you think?
We're going to talk about that in a second. So here's what I want to do. I want to take this and I want to diagram solutions to the problem. I want to explain it in a few different ways, okay? You can start by looking at the statistics, like we did. You can start by looking through the church fathers, people who came after the apostles, who wrote about stuff the apostles did and talked about the church as it was developing, right? And look for somebody to say, this is the first guy that wrote a gospel. You might get that. Woo! That's good. That would help, wouldn't it? I mean, I think it would. Somebody writing in the 2nd century, between 100 and 200, who says, this guy wrote his gospel first. Well, okay then. Like, that's source material to go on, isn't it? Okay. So here's where we're headed. Let's do some solutions. Really, we're not solving a problem, we're just explaining relationship here, right? Like if the 3 of you give me documents that share these statistics, the 4 of us are going to sit down. How did this happen? Were you all really using the same sources? Or did you steal stuff from each other? Who wrote first and passed it on to the next guy? Like, we're going to talk about that, aren't we? That's the same thing we're trying to do here. How did the documents we have end up the way that they are? Your point about the role of the Spirit needs to not be overlooked because it's significant, okay? It really is. If we believe these texts are inspired, then it's something we have to pay attention to. The reality is, some of this stuff with a synoptic problem is one of the first challenges Christians get about the legitimacy of the Gospels as inspired texts. Because look at the data, they had to be using sources. I don't have any problem with them using sources. But to say that because they're using sources, the texts aren't inspired goes too far, and I'm not willing to go there. Does that make sense? And so we can't overlook or underestimate the role of the Spirit in making sure that even if they did use each other as source material, that's part of the provision of the Holy Spirit. To validate, to confirm, right? To tell the same story in consistent ways, because it is the same story. Are you with me on this? Okay. Here's the most popular opinion today. Okay? We'll start with that one. It's called Markan priority. Say what? It's about Mark, and it means Mark is first. Okay, Markan priority looks like this. I'm going to do a brief over here. And now I'm going to diagram it. I'm going to draw. It's going to be terrible. Don't worry about it. Ready? Here's how it looks. Mark writes first. Okay? After Mark, Matthew. Why Matthew next? Because it's the middle in length, and it's also the middle in unique material, right? So if we're following this length theory that you brought up, you would add to it, then that would mean that if I start with Mark, and Matthew comes along and adds in the middle, then he should be the middle statistic for unique material. And then Luke should be the most because he knows the previous 2, and he's adding other instead of adding the same. Yeah? Because you're not going to add the same stuff. You're going to add stuff the others don't have. Is that making sense? Okay. So Mark, then Matthew. Then Luke. But Luke may not have just Mark, right? Luke, because of double tradition, material shared between Luke and Matthew, he might have Matthew as well. With me? So this explains what's common to all three of them. And it explains what's common to Matthew and Luke, but that may not be in Mark. Does that make sense? Are you with me on that? What about material that's unique to Luke? Where did Luke get it? What? From himself. Well, that's a problem because he's not a follower of Jesus with the 12. So where? Who? Luke tells us in his gospel, he interviewed eyewitnesses. He talked to people who saw it. That source gets labeled L. And it accounts for the unique material that belongs to Luke. Right? So when Matthew and Mark wrote, maybe they didn't talk about something with Philip or Bartholomew, one of the 12, two of the 12, that may have happened between them and Jesus, right? Or that they remember and wanted to talk about. Matthew and Mark didn't include it, but Luke talking to Philip was like, hey, yeah, we should talk about that. That's good. Right? Maybe Luke talked to a Roman centurion or to the Gentile woman who comes to him at dinner. Or maybe he had a different conversation with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Right? Yeah? Okay. What we might also need to include is a source for Matthew. Now, Matthew's source is probably his own eyewitness account because he was a disciple, he was there. So typically, Matthew's unique stuff, well, that's just Matthew. He was there, he watched it. He watched Peter get out of the boat and walk on water like a crazy person. He watched Jesus multiply bread and fish. Yeah? You with me?
Yes.
This is the most common solution to the problem. It's the most popular, and it relies purely on the stats. Okay? Good here? You want a different one? Because there's options. I'll give you a different one. Here we go. Oop. The next one is what we call Matthean priority, or this will be called Augustinian theory. I'll write it underneath in just a second. So this means Matthew first. We also call this Augustinian theory. It's named after Saint Augustine. He didn't come up with it, but he says this. Augustine, one of those fathers of the church, says Matthew was the first to write a gospel. Hey, I told you, if somebody said it in church history, you should probably pay attention to it. And so St. Augustine says, wait, Matthew wrote his gospel first. So it works like this. Matthew writes first. And then Mark perhaps uses Matthew's text. And then Luke can use them both, just like the last time. Again, Luke being last, because it makes the most sense based on what's in his gospel. Yes? Okay. Well, you can still then do this. There's some unique source, M, for Matthew. Okay? And there's some unique source for Luke. Probably those eyewitness accounts he's talking about. Matthew writes first, though. Typically, what's not included in Mark that is in Matthew is long sections of Jesus talking. And so Mark, if Matthew wrote first and Mark used Matthew's gospel, Mark left out the stuff where Jesus is just talking and went to like the action bits. Matthew's the documentary, Mark's the action film. That's the way to think about it. Does that make sense? Okay. Still good? There's one more idea that goes in any theory you put in there, and it's a source that we call Q. I'm going to explain what Q is and how it works. It's called Q from the German word Quelle, which means source. We got fancy with that, didn't we? Okay, so here's the idea. Especially if you take Mark in priority, it works like this. You have Mark, and you have Matthew, and you have Luke, right? What might be shared for Matthew and Luke is Q, which could be a source of stuff Jesus had to say. And it may not be available to Mark for whatever reasons, practically speaking. Right? Does that make sense? Here's the thing with Q when we look at synoptic solutions. It doesn't actually exist. At least we don't know that. It's a hypothetical. What if there's a source with all the stuff Jesus said in it recorded? And Matthew and Luke have access to it, but we don't know if it actually exists. It's just an idea. What if? Does that make sense? So what you can do on that Markan priority is add off to the side over here, Q, with lines that go to Matthew and Luke. Because it'd be shared. Does that make sense? You could also add it here, but it's less likely in this theory. Questions at this point? There's one more I want to introduce you to. This is probably getting closer to what I think. Okay? This opinion is the minority opinion by a lot. And in certain circles, will get you laughed at. I still think it's legitimate to consider. Fair? Okay. It's called oral tradition theory. Or for short, it's just called oral tradition. Here's the reality. We know from the first 100 years of the church, there's a common set of teaching and texts the church was using. We saw that yesterday in this acceptance of this list of 27 documents by 120 AD, right? And so oral tradition theory works like this. There's a common teaching from the apostles that everybody is familiar with. There's a set of stories everybody knows about Jesus. There's a set of teachings that everybody uses. There's a set of stuff that every church is familiar with and has at their disposal because of what the apostles teach. Good? From that, you get Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what they share is common to this. It may or may not be written down. It's what's taught in the churches about Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah. Following me here? And so what they have in common just comes because this is stuff everybody knows and has. And what they have as unique might still then come from a place like that. Luke's specific interviews with certain eyewitnesses, perhaps Mary Magdalene, who features prominently in the Luke account, right? And we still might have some material for Matthew because he's got some unique stuff and he was an eyewitness, so it may just come from him, right? And 3% is unique to Mark. Well, that just means the others maybe didn't pick up those threads from the common teaching. Or maybe it came to Mark through Peter. Right? Are you with me on this? Okay. Okay. What do you think now? Did I muddy the water enough? What are you thinking now? Just think out loud. Not necessarily about who's first, but what are you thinking now about the gospel?
Is there any like theory about, because I've heard that they all of them wrote the gospels for different people,
They do.
and could that play why there's some certain things in certain
Yes.
ones?
That explains a lot of the unique stuff.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily explain is the common stuff. How did they still get that common? Right? Does that make sense? Okay. I will say this. Almost nobody will make an argument that Luke wrote first. There's very, 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 if any people will make an argument that Luke, it's either Mark or Matthew. Among the synoptics, it's either Mark or Matthew. Okay? Are you with me on that? Markan priority requires that the gospel writers have each other's documents or documents like Q as source material, right? Stuff to work from, paper to look at and copy, okay? Either the Augustinian theory or this one, or the Markan priority, those both use documents as source materials, okay? Do you want to know what I think?
Yes.
I like oral tradition. I like it because of the historic practicalities of document transmission. I also like it because we know there's a strong thread of common teaching and oral tradition in the early church. That accounted for our list of 27 books, and it accounts for core sets of teaching and common elements, even between people like Peter in his letters and Paul in his letters, who use the exact same phrases. Like, to be dead to sin and alive to righteousness. That phrase and that paradigm is common to Paul in Romans and Peter in 1 Peter. How do you explain the commonality? They either spent a lot of time together in Rome when Peter wrote that letter and Paul rubbed off, which is hard to imagine for somebody like Peter, right? Or there's a common set of images and teaching and understanding among the apostles, and they're using the common set. Documents are hard to come by in the first century world, period. 2, they're writing in different places to different people. Mark might be writing his gospel in Rome, to the church in Rome. Matthew's probably writing to Palestinian Jewish Christians, leading up to some serious persecution. And Luke is writing to Gentiles across the Roman world. Probably to some of those churches Paul's done his missionary trip. The audiences are so vastly different. It's hard. And they're not necessarily in the same circles. Matthew seems to stay in Palestine. Mark travels with Paul and Barnabas and then gets connected to Peter in Asia Minor and travels with him. Luke hangs out with Paul his whole life. Did they cross paths enough to be familiar with and get a hold of those gospels? We don't know. Either way you slice it, we don't know. But at the end of the day, the contention is this: the Spirit inspired them. And just because they share material, just because we don't know how they got what they have, doesn't mean the texts we're looking at aren't inspired. I think it's something that looks like this. Here's the Miller theory for you, right? I think it works like this. Because we're told by St. Augustine, Matthew writes first. I'm okay saying I don't know if Mark used Matthew. I am. I'm okay saying he did use Matthew. Doesn't bother me. I think Mark to Luke is a stronger tie because Luke is later in composition, it seems. Make sense? Maybe. Probably, because if Matthew's first, there's a really good chance he's got access to what's going on with Matthew's gospel. Or he at least knows of it by the time he writes his. There's still got to be allowance for some unique material for Luke. Because he tells us he interviewed people. And he's the most unique among them. That's what I think. That puts me in a very small minority of people. Okay? Questions on this?